Well, good afternoon or good evening, everybody, depending upon where you are. I'm Roddy Gow, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this webinar on Adam Smith's influence and the state that we are in, with two very distinguished speakers. This, as probably most of you will know, is the tercentenary or 300-year anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, the extremely famous thinker and economist, about whom we shall hear more. Earlier this year, as part of celebrating that event, we heard from Gerard Lyons, who some of you will know again, a distinguished economist. And after this talk, later this month, we'll be hearing from Stephen King, senior advisor to HSBC, who's recently written a book on inflation. And then in September from Liz Martins, also of HSBC. But today we are fortunate to have, as I've mentioned, two very distinguished speakers, George Magnus and Eamonn Butler. George is a distinguished economist, well known for his book, Red Flags, who worked at a senior level with UBS and has spoken with us in the past. Dr. Eamonn Butler is the founder and leader of the Adam Smith Institute, which is based in London, and who speaks around the world on Adam Smith and his influence on people's thinking. And we'll hear more about that. But the Adam Smith cemetery, or should I say graveyard, is at the Canongate Kirk in Edinburgh, and it is a scene of pilgrimage for many people visiting Scotland from Asia. So as we get going, just to explain today's format, we are using the Zoom platform, which is what we usually do, which means that you're, as watching this, your photographs can't be seen, your images, and your mics are muted, but you are encouraged to ask questions in the chat or Q&A function. And after George and then Eamonn have spoken, we will later on have a Q&A session, giving you a chance to pose and put your questions to them, so that during the course of the next hour precisely, we should be able to cover a lot of ground. So to our speakers, thank you. To the audience, thank you for being with us. And to George, I hand over to you to start us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roddy, and a very good afternoon or good morning or wherever you happen to be, whatever time zone. It's a great pleasure always to speak for the ASI or with the ASI, and I think this particular topic about Adam Smith's tercentenary, I think, is particularly apt. I'm going to leave it to Eamonn just to tell you much more about the man himself and you know, what he might have thought or might not have thought, or how to contextualize his work. But my kind of takeoff point really for this is not to talk about the invisible hand or any of the kind of things that we know very well from The Wealth of Nations, but to think about the context within which Adam Smith was writing about the intersect between the state, the market, and civil society, and how people should organize and behave, and what role the state should play or not play, so as to realize, well, I mean, he called it the wealth of nations, but what he really meant was the better well-being of citizens. If that was relevant for him at the end of the 18th century, you could say, you know, with gusto, that it's relevant for us today, because these are precisely the same sort of questions that we're asking and wrestling with. And you could argue, indeed, some people do, that we are headed off in the completely wrong direction, or certainly a direction that's contrarian to what Adam Smith had written about, with new trade and industrial policies that are in some ways nationalistic, undermine the principle of competitive advantage or comparative advantage, efficiency, market discipline, the gains from trade, all of the things that we basically think of as the crown jewels of Adam Smith's economic thinking. I would only kind of suggest, in addition to that, that these aren't the only crown jewels. And we cannot say really in 2023 with a straight face that our concentration in the past on efficiencies and market discipline have left us in the place that we actually would prefer to be in, because we've seen populism, egregious corporate behavior, inequality, certainly lots of evidence of J.K. Galbraith's cocktail of private affluence and public squalor, which I presume Adam Smith might have had some rather acerbic things to say about, given his views as well. So I just also think that we've lapsed into this kind of space of wondering about this intersect. Not for the first time. I mean, it seems to happen roughly every 40 years, roughly speaking. So, you know, we did it in the 1900s at the end of globalization 1.0. We did it in the 1940s and 1950s at a very obvious time at the end of the Second World War. We did it again in the 80s and the 90s when we basically threw out, you know, the Keynesian bathwater, so to speak. And now we're doing it again, and presumably our children and grandchildren will continue to do it as this big pendulum swings backwards and forwards over time. But I think the context in which we're doing it is quite important. We've been buffeted for 15 years or so by a succession of transformational shocks that have rattled our institutions, resilience, and well-being of the citizenry. Globalization produced asymmetric benefits, so great benefits and wealth and richness for some, but inequality and insecurity and the withering of the industrial base for many others. The financial crisis shattered the middle class and its faith in the elite. The rise of China has threatened the system of beliefs and values that we hold dear and would like to be governed under. The pandemic exposed the weakness of supply chains and resilience. The Russian invasion of Ukraine exposed the dependency that we have, not just on Russia, but also on China, as unacceptable. And climate change, of course, was always an existential threat, but ever more so now. So as Jake Sullivan reported in his remarkable speech that he gave at Brookings in April, transformational shocks actually require transformational responses. Now, what's the relevance of Adam Smith to all of this? Well, Smith, as you know, was very much in favor of free markets, but he wasn't completely anti-state or 100% laissez-faire. Indeed, the state could and had to intervene for him in certain key, albeit limited, respects. He valued individual freedom, but he was also insistent on markets having an encasing framework of law, also very insistent on the role of public education, the improvement of what we would now call human capital, and very critical about the essential role to be played by social institutions. He was vehemently against monopoly and market abuse and concentrations of wealth. And he recognized, well, maybe this is my interpretation rather than his. Eamonn will presumably correct me afterwards if I'm wrong. But I think he recognized that public policy and limited government enterprises could have spillovers. Well, basically, we would call them nowadays externalities, which could be internalized by companies as part of their business strategies to produce better outcomes. But I just wanted to say a few things about trade and trade policy, because Smith was very vocal about this, as you know. So he was concerned, of course, with the specialization of production and work, more so, I would say, than of trade between nations as such. But he did have a lot to say about international trade policy. And so in arguing that consumption was the sole purpose of production, and that consumer interests should always trump producer interests, I think that's how I would have read him, he was kind of alienating himself in a way from the trade practices of several countries today, so to speak, such as China, Germany, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and even now Brazil, which pursue domestic policies which are precisely the antithesis of the kind of policy environment, I think, that he favored. He was, of course, essentially a free trader, if you believe there's any such thing actually as free trade, but also specified 4 caveats where governments could intervene, for example, in defense industries, where there were tax distortions to a level playing field, where there were retaliation against foreign restrictions on trade, and importantly, where liberalizing trade might cause unique hardship in the domestic economy. And in our times now, I think you can see how and why this kind of thinking and writing has revived. Because to be parochial, for example, you might say that Brexit was all about, or not all about, I should say, the kinds of things that Smith would have thought were important, like market size, distance, regulatory and competition distortions, and so on. In a wider context, you could also say trade restrictions related to, for example, cross-border carbon tax initiatives were very much kind of center stage. You could say the new dominance of national security over issues of some trade rules were very much center stage. You could say that trade and industrial policy measures, which are basically colloquially known as Bidenomics nowadays, are being enacted to relieve costs and economic damage which are being experienced by workers and by communities as a result of partly the consequences of globalization, but also unconstrained Chinese subsidies. In fact, my argument would be that probably the US administration would not have been driven to the point of having to subsidize decarbonization in the via the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, or provide for the kinds of measures which have been legislated under the CHIPS and Science Act, were it not for the fact that unrestrained Chinese subsidies had put the private sector in the United States in the kind of crosshairs, really, of not being able to catch up, left to its own devices. So I don't think I really want to say very much more than that, just in the sort of 10 minutes that I wanted to talk about. There's a lot that we could talk about with regard to trade policy, but the kind of mercantilism and the policies that are pursued, for example, by China, which I think there is a lot of more discussion about them nowadays, but I think it's just remarkable that a lot of the criticism that we read about nowadays, particularly with regards to Bidenomics or its imitators, because there are things going on, of course, in the EU and in the UK and Japan, Australia, and so on, that the criticism is really all about the countries that are either running trade deficits or trying to introduce discrimination. We should be blunt about it. It is discrimination. But maybe I would say justifiable discrimination, but because they're trying to operate on the import side, whereas countries that pursue mercantilist policies that are designed to suppress consumption and promote domestic production and domestic supply, which would certainly include China, but also a number of other countries, seem to get a free ride. And I think that's not only unfair, but wrong. Because the trade distortions that emanate from these kinds of policies are, I think, in many ways far bigger and far more damaging than the policies that we see being exercised by, let's say, the US and the EU, for that matter. So I think I'll just kind of leave it there, Roddy. I mean, there's a lot more that I've kind of put down in my notes here that I wanted to talk about, but I think that's probably caps my formal remarks at this stage.
George, thank you. That's very helpful. I've got one question for you before handing over to Eamonn. In the event of a change in the US administration, would you see a significant change in their trade policy?
I think, I suspect there might be. I mean, obviously, I think that's a sort of a veiled question, which is what happens if Trump gets back in?
Yes.
You're in the United States, and you may be a lot closer to this kind of discussion and debate than I am here in the west of England. But I mean, my hunch and my sort of suspicion really is that Trump's enablers really are probably going to be, if he were to win the presidential election, of course, that is what it all depends on, that his enablers would be much better prepared than they were in 2016, 17.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that while he may have, he may kind of walk away from Ukraine in ways which the Biden administration pretty clearly doesn't want to do, I think he would still be pretty tough on China, and quite isolationist, I would say, probably more so even than the Biden administration has been discriminatory in that regard. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your remarks, which were extremely interesting. Eamonn, can I now pass the baton to you to give us your thoughts?
Yes, so thank you very much, Roddy. Well, I mean, I think George is quite right to focus on that aspect of what Adam Smith was talking about. I mean, he talked about so many different things. He didn't just write on economics, he wrote on theory of science, and he wrote on language, and he wrote on the arts, and he wrote on moral philosophy. He knew everything. But he is, of course, known through the Wealth of Nations as being a great anti-mercantilist, in other words, a great proponent of free trade, which wasn't the case in his time, where countries set up barriers against foreign imports because they thought that in a transaction, it's only the person that ends up with the cash, the gold and the silver, that benefits from the transaction. And Smith's great breakthrough on that front was to say that no, in a voluntary transaction, both sides benefit, because the seller, yes, gets the cash, that's right, so they're visibly richer, but the buyers are invisibly richer because they've got the goods and the services, and they wouldn't even, the two of them wouldn't even get together and transact unless both sides thought that they were benefiting from the deal. So according to Smith, the best way to increase that value that both sides feel and to spread it as far and wide as possible is to make trade as free as possible and to get rid of tariff barriers and all the rest. And, you know, George is quite right at pointing out that Adam Smith lived in a world 250 years ago, which is much different from the world that we've got at the moment. And he could see, of course, foreign governments raising taxes, raising tariffs and import controls in order to protect their own industries. And of course, we see that all around the world today, particularly in things like agriculture. But I think the idea, and I suppose that Adam Smith, you know, was familiar with imperialism as well, that countries would use policy in order to corner trade. But I don't think that he really anticipated what we've got at the moment, which is countries that are blatantly using trade as an instrument of foreign policy. Not just economic policy, but political policy as well. So in the case of China, which you mentioned, George, you've got the Belt and Road. Well, arguably, yes, it's a great initiative and step forward in order to promote trade through the rest of the world with China. On the other hand, it could be seen as being a way to monopolize that trade and to try to bring more trade to China, more influence to China, and therefore more political clout from China in lots of different countries. And that is the worry, whether trade is being used as an instrument of foreign policy, basically to impose a certain foreign policy or a certain ideology, if you like, against Western ideology. So I think that is a very important point to focus on. But in general, yes, I mean, you said that every so often we have this crisis and we have to look at what the size of the state is, and I think we're very much there as well. That we've had, you know, you have wars, and then everybody says, "Oh well, let's centralize everything because it worked in the war. We won the war, and let's continue that through the peace." And that, of course, to Adam Smith gets you nowhere. That you don't need to try to control economic life in order to prosper. Indeed, it has the opposite effect, because cronies basically get together with politicians. Business cronies and politicians get together, and the business cronies say, "Well, we need new regulations here, here, and here." And the politicians say, oh, how very wise. Yes, that'll protect the public. What it does, of course, is keep out the competition. So Smith was very keen on keeping government as small as possible. I mean, the roles of defense and justice are big roles. He's not talking about a small government, but he's talking about limiting it to what it really is there to do, and running people's lives and running their economy, and deciding what they should eat, drink, and all of that sort of thing is not really what government is about. There is one other point about Smith, which I think is actually worth mentioning. That Smith, of course, he made his name and his fortune, not with a book on economics, but with a book on moral philosophy. And he talks about the virtues of prudence and justice and self-command. And these things, of course, are extremely important in business. Business is a moral activity, according to Smith. It spreads value between people, and it spreads value across the planet. It promotes prosperity, particularly of the poorest. I mean, Smith was very motivated by the plight of the working poor, and he thought that government controls and regulation promoted by business acted against the working poor and stopped them from bettering their own condition, as he put it. Smith was very keen on that, and he was very keen to insist that business is a virtuous occupation, and it should be so. And I think that's actually very important with a number of Asian countries. I mean, I was in Korea recently talking about this. And Korea is a country which has for a long time been if you like, a copycat catch-up economy. They're copying Western technology and doing it better and cheaper. But now it really has to move into the phase of being an innovative entrepreneurial economy. And so you're actually talking about lots and lots of new companies, lots and lots of smaller companies, lots of innovative companies, people doing things in new ways. And you need to root that in the principles of how you run your lives. What is good principles for living in general should be good principles for business. So I think that's, again, another message in Smith, which is very important in the Asian context. But I think, like George, I think I've said enough.
No, thank you very much, Eamonn. This is interesting. I'm going to bring in one question from Naomi Caligaro, who asks you both, could you comment, please, on the effect of Adam Smith economics on the major famines in India and Ireland during British rule in those countries? Eamonn, would you like to go first?
Golly, I'm not a historian. I think as far as I remember, the famine in Ireland was quite largely a political problem, as well as being a biological, agricultural a problem. That I think that because communications were bad and Britain didn't really take the crisis seriously enough and didn't understand what would happen, that was increased that. I think that it's fascinating that in the last 30 years, since about 1991, when a number of nations, India opened up in 1991. Of course, you had the Berlin Wall coming down in the late 80s, and therefore East Europe came into the world economic system. Since that, it is remarkable how we have extinguished dollar-a-day poverty. It's remarkable how we have extinguished famine. That these things mostly exist primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, but they also exist basically when there are wars. It is wars that cause these things. And that's why Adam Smith said the only thing that you need to take a country from the lowest poverty to the highest prosperity is peace first, low taxes, and a good administration of justice. So, but peace was number one for him, and that is the killer. And if you want to look at the causes of of famines, look at that. And political forces blocking others from helping out when crops fail and there's droughts and things like that. So I think Adam Smith would have no problem that his economics is the solution to these problems and not the cause.
Thank you. George, I'm also minded of the fact that the Russians have been weaponizing trade with dire consequences for others, and some of the famines that we've talked about, a result of the raw material coming from Ukraine getting to the rest of the world. Perhaps you could comment on that, George.
I don't like ever to be dismissive of questions, but where my expertise is a bit thin on the ground, I think it's always judicious for me to do so. So, I mean, I don't really know how to address the issue of, certainly I don't really know how to address the issue of Ireland and India because I'm just not sufficiently familiar with the history. And I don't really know, I mean, yeah, the weaponization of trade in and of itself, of course, is an awful thing to do. I mean, obviously the Russians do it or have done it with regards to Ukrainian grain supplies through invading Ukraine in a very kind of blatant and horrible way. I mean, there are other ways in which people weaponize trade. I mean, you could say that sanctions, whether they're exercised by the United States or the EU or by China, are ways of weaponizing trade. You could say that freezing somebody's reserves or dollar accounts are ways of weaponizing the currency in which trade is conducted, which is the US dollar. I mean, all of these things are true. I mean, we would sooner not do them, I think. And they are certainly things that give rise to inefficiencies and distortions and what have you. But they are a political reality, and I'm afraid that that's just something we have to live with. I mean, I do think we do need to dispose ourselves, or of the notion that free trade, and particularly when we talk about free trade agreements, there is no free trade agreement really is about free trade. I mean, it's all about setting up arrangements, rules, regulations that affect health and safety, the environment, labor markets, technology transfer, procurement, and goodness knows what else. So, no trade is really free. Obviously, the trade agreements over the last 3 or 4 decades have become, in many ways, more liberal because they're less restrictive, but they still are built around agreed restrictions, which is why they also have courts that actually hear disputes and so on. So, yeah.
Could I just say, George, on sanctions? Yes, you're an economist, and I'm, I suppose, a political economist, and obviously we hate interruptions in trade of any sort, and sanctions, of course, are one of those. But I mean, there is a school of thought that says that, well, sanctions are bad, but outright warfare is even worse. So, perhaps that is one way of limiting the resort to actual physical violence. Though, as you said, Adam Smith, pointed out that when you start these things, you get retaliation, and therefore you're probably better not to do them. But at the same time, it's better than outright warfare.
Oh yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that.
No, I
steer clear of, just that they are, but they introduce distortions. They are. I mean, they are. We should not. Well, we can't pretend that we are not actually weaponizing the trading system when we do that. But we do it because we think we have the moral high ground in doing it. And that, as you say, it is a step short of actually, coming to blows.
Yeah. And I think it's actually worse than that, because you can promote sanctions and make yourself sound very high-minded, but maybe part of the idea of those sanctions is to protect your own industries against foreign competition, and that's a very common thing that one sees.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a difference, obviously, between, I don't know, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, but there are obviously trade sanctions that are not the same as the kind of sanctions that we levied against have levied against Russia, because we think it is a pariah and should be made a pariah, and should be excluded. I mean, that's sanctioned for the form of punishment rather than for protection per se. Yeah.
On that subject, I see Martin Allen has said, isn't the biggest weapon today the power of poor governance? An excellent phrase, he said, that I heard today. Perhaps one of you mentioned that. The power of poor governance.
Of poor
governance.
Oh, right. Right. I'd be interested to know what Martin meant by that. I'm not quite sure. I mean, as a weapon, I mean, there is poor governance. I mean, not everywhere, but I mean, in a lot of places that we would look, in terms of, industrial policies and trade policies and attitudes towards private firms and so on and so forth. I mean, these things are also create, terrible kind of tensions and distortions. But I wonder what he means by the weapon of poor governance.
He's raised separately this question. If Smith spoke about production and demand, did he mention innovation and solutions? Eamonn.
I think, well, like many things, he never used the word capitalism and things like this, right? He was writing in a different age and people thought rather differently. But everybody in the 18th century was very much in favor of progress, obviously. This was the big thing. The economy was starting to work, the market economy was starting to work and deliver prosperity, and people wanted more of it, and lots of things were changing, the pattern of business was changing. Yes, innovation was very much on the minds of Adam Smith and actually all of his contemporaries. And I think now we have a different view in it because we have an evolutionary view. I mean, Smith's first book came out 100 years before Darwin's Origin of Species. He didn't have an evolutionary explanation for these things. But we know, as in biodiversity, you need lots of different species around so that when there's some problem like, I don't know, climate change or asteroids falling down, you've got a diversity of wildlife there to fill the gaps. And it's exactly the same in economics. You need a diversity of ideas so that when circumstances change, you can still be there producing things, and you need a diversity of ideas because that's the way you cultivate innovation. It's the way that you devise new products. It's the way that you provide better products that make people's lives better, and therefore, that is the way that you make progress. So I think Adam Smith was very strong on progress, yes, and he would tell us that today.
Later on this year, we're going to have a session on artificial intelligence. I wonder what he would have made of that. Progress or a huge threat? What would you think?
Well, I think like George, I never try to put 21st century ideas into the mouth of an 18th century character. We used to, at the Adam Smith Institute, we used to publish lots of reports, and we'd always put a quote from Adam Smith in the front of them. But when you start talking about, the pension system or whatever, well, it didn't exist in his day. So, and people would phone me up and say, oh, what do you think Adam Smith would have said about airport expansion? I don't know. I have no idea. So I think we do need to be careful about that.
Yeah. George, any observations on that?
Yeah, I came across this quite recently, actually, in another kind of forum where the subject of Smith came up because of the tercentenary, and somebody asked me also about, I can't remember the precise question, but it was about technology, and I probably know a fraction of what Eamonn knows about Adam Smith's writings, but I don't recall really anything that I can remember reading about that would be relevant. But I suppose, how we deal with technology or artificial intelligence in terms of, on the regulatory side, what we think private firms might be capable of achieving or accomplishing. I mean, the mix between public and private. I mean, I think all of these things would weigh on, should weigh on, and will weigh on the way that we think about it. Obviously, we're not going to go, at least I don't think we are, going to go the sort of the Beijing route of really trying to control artificial intelligence in the way that it's already tried to control the internet and build firewalls around it. Or in some cases, or in some respects, actually quite successfully from their point of view. Yeah, so I think yeah, it's the kind of how you go about kind of organizing it, which I think is of some interest to us. Yeah,
I think it's interesting that the EU is taking a very prescriptive line on AI regulation, a very precautionary line, whereas the UK is much more optimistic about it and thinks that there needs to be less regulation. And I think that's interesting and useful, actually, that we can see which of these is actually going to deliver the goods. But I think you need to look at AI as being a whole package of lots of different things. It's not just one thing. And you need to work out, right, well, are there particular bits of it which are a real existential threat if it goes wrong, whereas probably 99.9% of it is perfectly innocuous and it's not going to do us any harm, and it's actually going to make us much more efficient and improve our lives. So I think that we need regulation which is tailored for the actual potential threat that there is, rather than just jumping to regulate everything.
yeah.
I've been asked if you could comment on the influence of Maria Edgeworth to political economics. I couldn't. I wonder if either of you could. Do you know Maria?
No, it's not my subject at all.
George?
No, sorry, pass.
Okay, all right. And here's Naomi Kaligara again, referring to comments by Amartya Sen at an LSE lecture a few years ago, who said that famines that were a regular feature of life in India during British rule ceased to be so after India became independent of Britain in 1947, and that since India's independence, the average lifespan of Indians in India has doubled. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there is an association between independence and rising life expectancy, but I think it's probably a little bit simplistic to say that it's all down to independence. I mean, because with effect from, I don't know when it all started, probably in the 60s or the 70s, I mean, rising life expectancy was a global feature. And I'd be a little bit hesitant about attributing causation to, independence from colonial rule. I mean, lots of countries that weren't, under colonial rule or had nothing to do with empire also experienced the same kind of thing. So I think that's, I don't think that's not really something that I would kind of think had any kind of causal consequences. But I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm no wiser now than I was when she asked the question. I'm sorry and I have to apologize to her. I mean, I'd have to kind of bone up really on those free trade policies that were done under the empire to actually know how they were, how they affected Indian grain production and supply and so on.
Yeah. Adam Smith, of course, talked about British colonialism in America, and he was very much against colonialism because he thought that basically the colonial power arranged things in its own benefit and not in the benefit of the people who were colonized. So even though the colonialists in America regarded themselves as British, but I think to some extent that may have happened in India. But again, I'm not a historian and I can't really comment on that. But again, a country being able to do things its own way, it can try new things. But also, again, the world was getting more integrated after the Second World War. and we were beginning to realize that we had to cooperate with each other, and allowing food and technology in is something which is extinguished famines, not just in India, I think, but in many other places. If you're open to that kind of activity, if you're open to trade, then the chance of getting a famine is much less.
Yeah, I just like to echo maybe something that you said a little bit earlier, Eamonn, actually also, which is, if you think about it, actually since the end of World War II, I mean, the great kind of, okay, we haven't really done very much of it lately, but I mean, the great liberalizing global agreements that in trade that actually created, that were done originally under the auspices of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which later became the WTO. I mean, was certainly, that was a catalyst for the welfare of nations, I would say, including many emerging and developing nations, including, well, maybe not so much including India. India's always been a little bit kind of cagey about free trade itself. But I think most economists would subscribe to the view that what we called free trade and its evolution in the last 40 or 50 years has been a liberating force on the quality of life and freedom from famine and from other economic ills in much of the world. So yeah, we shouldn't necessarily again associate free trade in the way that we've understood it post the 1950s with anything other than, generally speaking, favorable developments. What the colonial free trade rules might have been could be something else, but again, not my forte, I'm afraid.
Thank you. The mission of the Asia-Scotland Institute being to increase people's knowledge of Pan-Asia and the countries within the region, particularly given the historic links between the Scots and many parts of Asia. One notices that totalitarian states will point to democracies and say how relatively inefficient they are at functioning and how troublesome their people can be. And that is no doubt what China says, looking at parts of the West. I wonder, though, whether you believe, both of you, that Adam Smithian thinking is a means of changing attitudes from in the totalitarian state world towards democracies.
So I mean, I think that's a rhetorical question. But I mean, of the two that we are most aware of and conscious of nowadays, I mean, we could also talk about North Korea or about Venezuela and other kind of autocratic states as well, like I mean, Turkey, for example, I mean, or illiberal democracies rather than autocracies, if you wish. But I think, with regards to Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China, I mean, and notwithstanding the fact that Marx was an avid reader of Adam Smith and arguably based a lot of his work on his interpretations and his understanding of Smith's writing. But I mean, obviously contemporary Russia is not a Marxist state in any way. It's, questionable whether the Soviet Union was, I mean, maybe in some respects, but I mean, theirs was a sort of a total rejection of Smithian ways of thinking, and Putin's Russia is a sort of an oligarchy and totalitarian state that actually rejects individual freedoms and rights and so on and so forth. And there's nothing, and I know China, I mean, much better than I know Russia, but there's certainly nothing in the history of the Communist Party of China going back to its being in government from 1949, nor in the writings and words of and documents produced by Xi Jinping that suggest that they see any redeeming features in any of the things that he believed in or wrote. In fact, there is an infamous document number 9 that was produced in the sort of 2 or 3 years after Xi Jinping took power, which expressly forbids most of the things that we would associate with the writing and teaching of Adam Smith. So, short answer to your question is no. I don't think there's anything there at all.
Eamonn.
Well, I think that I can see that people in Asia in particular look down on democracy, because sometimes it does get itself in a pickle, and you've got different people pulling in different directions. And when you have a crisis, democracy isn't necessarily the best way to deal with that, because you do have so many different views, and then which one do you choose? But the problem for totalitarian alternatives is that, fine, you may be very quick at choosing a solution to a crisis, but is it the right solution? And totalitarian regimes have a terrible habit of choosing the wrong solution when crises hit. And the other thing, of course, is that you're putting all of your eggs in one basket. You make decisions, and that is how the whole economy, the whole society is going to work. And if you're wrong, well, then you're in a serious problem. And one sees this with the history of communism in Russia, for example, that you had an economic system, very top down, very centralist, telling people exactly how things should be run. And did it produce value and prosperity? No, it didn't. The mess that is America produced far more prosperity than that. So democracy has got a lot going for it.
I mean, just to sort of supplement that, really, if you take a kind of real-time example of the People's Republic of China, I mean, and bearing in mind what we've already said about Adam Smith's kind of teaching that the purpose of production basically is to consume, and the function of consumption is to make people happier and to increase their well-being. I mean, the share of consumption in the Chinese economy is now probably not much higher than it was in the year 2000, which is about 38 to 39%. That's roughly half of what it is in most developed countries, and also in a number of China's peer group countries like Turkey or Mexico, for example. Much of the kind of economic discussion amongst China watchers and others over the last kind of 10 years really has been about, quote, rebalancing in China. And China, and even actually China's leaders in the previous administration, so these are ex-President Hu Jintao and ex-Premier Wen Jiabao, were very vocal about the fact that China was an unbalanced economy and needed to reboot. But the trouble is the politics of China prevent them from taking the kinds of measures that would actually give rise to the more kind of consumerist kind of society, or a kind of a different kind of economic model where the purpose of production and the purpose of and the upshot in terms of consumption would be different from what it is today. And I think they're stuck. They can't really, without changing the political system, they can't really change the economic model that much. So, yeah, I think it's a blockage for them.
George, as you have written, Xi's need to satisfy the demands of the growing middle class must form a critical part of his economic policy.
Yes, I mean, I think it's sort of devil in deep blue sea for the Chinese government. I mean, they obviously know, that the well-being of citizens is a good thing, and that their security, they being the Communist Party's security in power, rests on the approval and happiness of citizens. I mean, they know that. I mean, they're not silly, but the politics blinds them to the changes which need to be made in order to bring that about. So I think it is a sort of a conflicted situation which they find themselves in, where they want people to be collectively they're not so interested in the individual pursuit of wealth and happiness, but they want collectively people to become better off. But I think whether it's in the sort of real estate speculation which has gone awry, or whether it's because of the structure of the development model which suppresses consumption, or lots of other things, the governance structure which is trying to kind of control the activities of private companies so that they are compatible with the state and the party. I mean, they can't really get off that wagon, and so I think they are seriously stuck, actually, and I'm not quite sure, obviously, how that will all evolve over the next decade or so.
Thank you, George. In the few minutes that are left to us, just reminding ourselves of the title of this talk, Adam Smith's Influence on Our Political Economy and the State We Are In. I think we've touched on that a lot, but perhaps, Eamonn, starting with you, you'd like to give us, if you could encapsulate in, say, 3 minutes, your reactions to what you've heard and what you've been able to say as against that subject.
Yes, well, we focused a lot on trade, but as I say, Adam Smith was a much wider writer, and indeed, his contribution is not that he was the first economist. He wasn't. His contribution was that he systemized economy into economics into a recognizably modern form, and on the very first page of The Wealth of Nations, for example, he introduces the idea of gross domestic product. He doesn't call it that, but that's what it is, and GDP per capita and productivity. So he really was a revolutionary thinker. And of course, his work on the division of labor, the famous pin factory example, and the importance of trade and competition and how those draw resources to the most valued purposes. All of these things are very important and often forgotten, particularly by politicians who, as George says, get absorbed by their own politics. So he really did feel that you could have what F.A. Hayek 2 centuries later called a spontaneous order, that if you leave people alone, the system of natural liberty, as Smith called it, they'll get on with their own lives and they'll probably do okay. So you don't need to boss them around. And the idea of a ruler that can anticipate exactly what people need and provide that is a daydream. So I think that all of that is that background to Smith is very important to us today, and we need to remember that. I think we also need to remember his stress, his moral thinkings, and his stress on the empathy that exists between human beings. We are social creatures, and we tend to do things that will make other people happy because that makes us happy too. It's just the way that we're built, and so we're a very social species, and empathy again is an extremely important thing in our lives. So I always think of Smith as being not an economist or a moral philosopher, but as a social psychologist. He was really looking at the human mind and trying to get inside it and think, how do we work and what is it that motivates us, and how do we organize that in a way which benefits the whole of humanity. And I think that's probably the challenge here today.
Eamonn, thank you very much indeed. George, closing comments, as it were, from you, from your viewpoint?
Yeah, I've been thinking as in fact, I didn't manage to get around to talk about it at the beginning, but I've been thinking as we've been talking through this about something called productivism, which actually is a concept that's been sort of written about by the American economist Danny Roderick. So productivism really is about the dissemination of good things in the economy, productive economy, et cetera, but throughout all regions and all segments of the labor force. It's a sort of a Smithian way of thinking about the well-being of citizens rather than maybe the sort of the kind of neoliberal kind of economic legacy which we've inherited really from the 1980s and so on. And under this kind of school of thought, I mean, there are things that he's borrowed, and you might say that he's kind of borrowed from Smith, but other things which are definitely not. things that Smith might have approved of. So, you know, he has much less faith in the ability of markets to achieve all desirable outcomes, but he's very suspicious of large corporations. He thinks that production and investment are much more valued to society than finance. He thinks that revitalizing of local communities over globalization is something which we should think about. He departs from the Keynesian welfare state with its kind of focus on redistribution and social transfers. He's more interested in creating economic opportunities for people and good jobs, productive jobs in local communities. Now, you might say this is all a bit kind of airy-fairy, but actually, I mean, if you read his work, he's obviously very serious about, you know, the ultimate goal, which is the welfare of citizens, which is, you know, something that everybody would share with Smithian teaching. The question is, what's the best route to get there? And, you know, what he's raising here are things that are very kind of controversial compared with the legacy that we've had for the last kind of 30 or 40 years.
Thank you, George. Well, I think we're now drawing to a conclusion so that people can move on. I'm very, very grateful to both of you for your input and for answering some, but not all of the questions, because there were still some there, but we have to draw a close. Those of you who have enjoyed this webinar, please mark your calendars for the 26th of this month, when, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have Stephen King on the subject of inflation, which he's written about. And then there will be other events in the coming weeks on, amongst other things, artificial intelligence, and also the role of slightly different subject, Scottish influence in Asia on botanics and forestry, because there's been a huge influence on botanical gardens in Asia, much of which emanated from Scotland, and we will be doing that in conjunction with the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. So to all of you, thank you for giving up your time. A very interesting 60 minutes, and I'm sure that everybody on this call is a great deal wiser than they were when we started. And to George and to Eamonn, thank you both very much indeed, and to Andrew for making it happen from a technical standpoint. To all of you, thanks.